Social structure is the patterns of social arrangements in society. They are both emergent from and determinant of the actions and relations between agents. As enduring patterns of behavior and interaction, they define some form of order to the overall system. Social structures are typically complex and recurring patterns of organization. Social institutions are a central object of study within the social sciences. They represent enduring patterns of organization or structure built up around some social function. Religions, governments, and families are all institutions that have stood the test of time because they provide essential structure and serve basic functions within social systems. For the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they define institutions as structures or mechanisms of social order and cooperation, governing the behavior of a set of individuals within a given community. We can see in this definition the idea that institutions primarily exist to maintain order and structure. But here's another widely used definition for social institutions as, quote, a persistent constellation of status, roles, values, and norms that respond to important societal needs. This interpretation places emphasis on the idea of social needs and institutions as mechanisms for performing functions to solve those needs. To give an example of this, we might think about the institution of education from these two different perspectives. We could interpret it as either serving the important function of educating students in the knowledge they need to become working citizens, or equally, we can understand the educational system as a mechanism of social order which governs the behavior of a set of individuals within a given community. Both of these different interpretations to institutions are equally valid and prevalent within the literature.
Institutions are essential parts of any society. Think about it. Police stations, schools, hospitals, businesses like Walmart and Trader Joe's are all core parts of a community. In a sense, they impose structure on how individuals behave. For example, if all the laws that exist in our community disappeared, would I still have a normal day? Probably not. People would be speeding down the street, looting my neighborhood coffee shop, and perhaps a stranger would be sleeping on my living room couch. All the things that I'm used to would be completely disrupted. Maybe a more reasonable example is, let's say all the schools had a new rule of no classes on Fridays. Then parents would have to figure out childcare for that day. Institutions and their rules definitively guide what we do. You may be thinking that you don't have a kid and maybe you don't need childcare services, but in general, individuals are reliant on the institutions in their community. But is the reverse true? Do institutions need individuals? In general, they need lots of folks to contribute to allow them to function, but they don't typically need any one random individual. So there's a bit of an imbalance between institutions and individuals, if that makes sense. While they need individuals and are created by groups of individuals, they will continue even after the individual is gone. The concept of institutions may seem like a daunting idea, but try thinking of them as just a form fulfilling a need. Institutions meet the needs of society by filling expected roles and behaviors. For example, in order for a society to continue, it needs people year after year after year. The family institution makes sure that there will be people to carry on the next generation. We know society needs a way to keep people healthy, so you have the medical institution. And society even needs a way to encourage innovation and progress, so you have universities. We average people might think of just a business or corporation when we hear the word institution. A sociologist, on the other hand, thinks of social structures when they hear the word institution. They think of governments, families, hospitals, schools, the legal system, religion, as well as businesses. Each of those parts of society continues on without regard to any individual. Governments continue even after the people within them turn over. Families continue from one generation to the next. Laws continue on after the people who wrote them are long dead and buried. Hospitals, schools, businesses, all continue past the time span of any individual and are not dependent on any one individual either.
Social institutions provide the paths and roads in our lives. They are the default positions that have already been created. They are the established institutions of culture, politics, and the economy that enable us to go further, faster, easier, to do more. They enable us, but they also constrain us, and they are the frameworks through which power is exercised.
Each of us belongs to several types of groups. Some groups provide intimacy and close relationships, while others do not. And two main types of groups are called primary and secondary groups. But first, let's look at primary groups. And an example that helped me understand primary groups is a wedding. And as we can see, there's a bride and a groom here. And think about who gets asked to be a bridesmaid or a groomsman. It's usually the bride and groom's closest friends or their really close family members. And that's an example of a primary group because in primary groups, there's a sense of belonging and a shared identity. And group members care about you, and you care about other members of the group as well. And you have the sense of loyalty to each other. And belonging to the group is the whole value of the friendship in itself. You're not in it to gain any sort of goal or anything like that. So individuals in primary groups, they provide sort of an anchor point, and you were born into a primary group, your family. And you meet with members of your primary groups face to face, and you know a lot about their lives. And these close relationships are often seen as a source of close human feelings and emotions, such as love, cooperation, and concern. Now, another type of group is called secondary groups. And secondary groups are those with formal, impersonal, and business-like relationships. And they're often temporary, and they, on the other hand, are based on a specific limited purpose or goal. So these relationships are usually short-term, as we said, and you would only do a few goal-directed activities with these people in your secondary groups, like maybe attending a lunch meeting to talk business. So people in secondary groups often see them as a means to an end, meaning that they are only part of the group to accomplish a task or to earn money, for example. So let's say this wedding is over now, and let's head to the reception to look at some of the different primary and secondary groups. So the bride and groom are going to sit with their bridal party, as we said, and these are the close friends that they have known for a very long time and close family. So let's say the groom played football in college, and a lot of his teammates are attending the wedding. So they sit close to him as well because they are in his primary group. They put countless amounts of hours in practicing with each other, and they really grew up and learned how to live on their own in college. So they're an example of one of his primary groups. Sitting together in the primary group, we may also have the bride and groom's immediate family, like their brothers and sisters, or their moms and dads. So let's say the bride grew up in a really great neighborhood and was friends with everyone on her street. Everyone grew up together and hung out on the weekends, and they often would take trips to the beach and have cookouts as a neighborhood, as a community. So this is an example of her primary group. So you could say that all these people, the neighborhood friends, the close family, the teammates, these are examples of primary groups within the bride and groom's life. But as we make our way around the reception, we can see that there are many different secondary groups as well. Over here, the bride and groom's parents may have invited some of their important work partners. And over here, there is some distant family that is only seen once or twice a year or at big family gatherings. And let's say over here there's some acquaintances. They aren't close friends, but they're well connected, so maybe they could help the bride and groom in the future. So they invite him to the wedding. So these secondary groups are more formal and goal-oriented. So looking around this wedding reception, there are a lot of guests who are there to keep strong relationships in case they are needed in the future to make money, or maybe even the distant family members are also there to keep everyone happy and to avoid family drama and hurting anyone's feelings. So these are all examples of the bride and groom's secondary groups. They aren't close relationships, they're more informal. So we'll just put an S for secondary. So the big takeaway from this video is that primary groups are close, intimate, long-term relationships, and that secondary groups are short-term and often goal-oriented relationships.
Ascribed status is the social status a person is assigned at birth or assumed involuntarily later in life. It is a position that is neither earned nor chosen but assigned. These rigid social designators remain fixed throughout an individual's life and are inseparable from the positive or negative stereotypes that are linked with one's ascribed statuses. The practice of assigning such statuses to individuals exists cross-culturally within all societies and is based on gender, race, family origins, and ethnic backgrounds. For example, a person born into a wealthy family has a high ascribed status based solely on the social networks and economic advantages that one gains from being born into a family with more resources than others. In contrast, an achieved status is a social position a person takes on voluntarily that reflects both personal ability and merit. An individual's occupation tends to fall under the category of an achieved status. For example, a teacher or a firefighter. Individuals have control over their achieved statuses insofar as there are no restrictions associated with their ascribed statuses that could potentially hinder their social growth. Ascribed status plays an important role in societies because it can provide the members with a defined and unified identity. No matter where an individual's ascribed status may place him or her in the social hierarchy, each has a set of roles and expectations that are directly linked to each ascribed status and thus provides a social identity.
There are a number of ways in which we socially construct the world around us. In other words, we use our social interactions with others to make sense of and give purpose to our lives. One way in which we do this is to create social structures that give us cues for how to behave. Statuses and roles are two of these structures. We previously discussed statuses in depth, so now we turn to social roles. A social role defines a set of behaviors that are expected of someone who holds a particular status. It's easy to confuse a status and a role, but the basic difference between them is that we occupy a status and play a role. Every status has an expected set of behaviors, a role. A woman becomes a mother when she has a child, and so occupies the status of mother. She's expected to also play the role of mother by caring for and loving her children, among other things. Interestingly, role expectations can change over time and also differ between cultures. Not that long ago, it was a role expectation for mothers to stay at home with their children and keep house, while the fathers played breadwinner. Today in our culture, this still occurs, but is no longer a strict expectation of the mother's role, just an acceptable option. In other cultures, however, a mother working outside the home is still considered to be strange or even unacceptable. All of us typically occupy many statuses and play the roles attached to